So before the break, we were talking about the possibility of a shutdown because Congress fails to pass a CR. I mean, over the last several decades, we've seen a number of shutdowns of varying lengths, and it often turns into sort of this blame game of, who's responsible for shutting down the government. I mean, from your perspective, Jon, are there any winners or losers, either politically or from a policy sense, of shutting down the government? And some people seem to think it's a good idea, but I mean, is it a good idea, and should it ever happen?
So my perspective is that there's very little evidence that government shutdowns matter at all, one way or the other. Typically, what you see in the polling response after a shutdown is that voters basically blame both sides. Why can't these people just get an agreement? Like, it just looks like a lot of noise emanating from Washington and a fight for kind of silly reasons. And voters have a hard time distinguishing whose fault that is. And the clearest example of this was in 2013, when the Republicans, led by then Senator Ted Cruz, and by the way, his chief of staff at the time, Chip Roy, who's now a congressman from Texas, leading the shutdown fight for the conservatives in the House. The two of them, just dragged the government into what at the time was the longest shutdown in American history. And it was very clearly Republicans' fault. Like, it was like, no doubt about it. Who gets the blame for this thing? It was these two guys and the Republicans who pushed the government in this direction. And, it was over whether or not they were going to fund Obamacare. And what you saw in the polling was, both parties took a modest hit. It just looked like more increased dysfunction coming out of Washington, D.C. And then in 2014, what happened was the Republicans won seats in the Senate and took it back. So the feedback cycle of the votes suggests, and you've heard Chip Roy make this point recently, the feedback cycle from that incident suggested to Republicans that this actually, if you stand up and fight for your constituents, you're going to end up winning electorally. But there's very little evidence from that. I mean, we're a year out from the 2024 elections. Almost certainly the issues that settle the 24 elections are going to be radically different than these fiscal issues. And whether or not the government shuts down for a day or a week or a month in 2023, my guess will be completely irrelevant in the 24 election cycle. And by the way, there's no evidence to suggest that the reason the Republicans won the Senate in 2014 was because of the shutdown. It has more to do with the fact it was the 6th year of a presidential term, and there's just kind of voter fatigue with the party in power at that point. So the bigger dynamics are far more important, I think, to electoral outcomes than these questions of what exactly is happening when in Washington.